afternoon, and welcome to our third panel, possibly the last in our series, entitled Current Race Issues, Where We Go From Here. We've discussed microaggressions, and even though they are sometimes minor and often unintentional, they can have a huge impact when BIPOC folks deal with them on a daily basis. We've also discussed history from multiple perspectives, and its importance is highlighted when a former senator states that, quote, "We birthed a nation from nothing." I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, there isn't much Native American culture in American culture, end quote. So we've been discussing this idea of what is American and where does our culture and history come from? Is it white and European, or does it include indigenous people, descendants of slaves, immigrants from south of the border, and people of Asian descent? So where do we go from here? Yesterday was the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. We saw his killer convicted on all counts, yet we also saw more Black and brown people killed by police. Today, we will discuss current race issues with our esteemed panel. Jesse Bulluck of District 25 Alumni, Lauren Bush, and Jaquon Irby, District 25 Justice. So first, I'll give you all a chance to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into it. We'll start with Jesse.
So good afternoon to everyone. Again, my name is Jesse Bulluck, Langston Chapter, District 25 alumnus. I currently live and work in Raleigh, North Carolina. I am, so my legal work is unrelated to what we're talking about today, but in my other life, I work on the academic side, and I do most of my research in the area of educational policy and issues regarding education and law, basically. And I bring in a lot of research on race and social justice issues, civil rights issues that we see within our school systems. So that gives you a little bit about my background. It's Jaquon or Lauren.
Thank you. Yeah, let's go with Lauren next.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Bush. I was a member of the Darrow chapter, University of Maryland, Baltimore, while I was in law school, and I'm currently the justice of the Baltimore Alumni Chapter. I reside outside of Baltimore, Maryland, but I work in Washington, D.C. at the Department of Veterans Affairs, Board of Veterans Appeals. It's wonderful to be here, and I can't wait to discuss with you all.
Thanks. Jaquon?
Hi, I'm Jaquon Irby. I am joined Phi Alpha Delta through the Lamar chapter. I am currently the District 25 Justice covering North and South Carolina. Definitely excited to be here, and thanks for the invitation to flesh out some good discussion of pretty much where do we go from here based off of the past events that recently happened.
Great. And I'll give everyone 10 minutes or so to discuss a couple current race issues that have been on their minds, and then we'll have some discussion. And let's start with Jesse again.
Sure. So again, in my, I guess, day-to-day work, I am looking at a lot of issues that are occurring in our education systems. Oops. Sorry, I forgot to turn my video back on. So again, I'm looking at a lot of issues that are happening within our education systems, which right now we know that we're in the midst of trying to transition the majority of our students back into the schools. They've been outside of the physical school buildings for over a year now because of the coronavirus. And so one of the main things that I looked at is the sort of digital divide that we have within our country, meaning the difference between our urban and our rural schools and the access that students have to the internet at home. Most of the time, you can also factor in issues of race and social class. A great number of students don't have access to either a computer or the internet at home or both, which means that the past year, the pandemic has presented a challenge to schools because they're not able to educate all of their students because of a lack of resources. And so many schools have had to come up with different ways to sort of provide these items to students, whether it be giving them a mobile hotspot to take home along with a tablet or something, some other device that they can take home so that they can continue to do their work. Other school systems sort of looked into this sort of hybrid model of, bringing in bringing in some students, but then leaving some at home so that, you can, so that they could exercise social distancing and the other guidance that was around at the time. And so, looking at all of these issues, we definitely see that the divide between different, like I said, social classes and different racial groups. And the concern that we have now is that there was already this sort of achievement gap between groups of students. And so now with the pandemic, we're anticipating students being behind not only a year, but possibly more, a year or two in their studies. And so there's a lot of questioning about, the resources that we have available that we can give and provide to students. And then there's a lot of questioning about, well, are we using the right standards? Are we going about education, in the correct way that it benefits all students and sets them up for more educational opportunities later in life? And so there's a lot of talk about that going on. That's one of the major things that I'm looking into right now. The other, which I guess depending on who you talk to may come across as something controversial, is this idea of state legislatures certain states have been trying to remove critical race theory from being taught in schools. And so, just to start off, critical race theory generally is not taught in schools. It's not something that, second graders are learning. Critical race theory, it comes out of the critical legal studies, is the foundation. And basically it's just a way of looking at, it's a framework that researchers use to kind of look at social issues that we're dealing with, and the way that the system has been built to sort of limit opportunities for certain groups of people, is the gist of it. And of course, if I have more time, I can go into greater detail about it, but it's not what is being made out to be. And so there's a discussion there that is happening within many of the education and legal circles that I'm in now, just trying to figure out the best way to kind of get information out to the public so that we have a good understanding of what's going on and we're not getting lost in sort of a lot of the language that people are using to kind of distract us from things that may actually be happening and that are more important to kind of focus on right now. But I'll stop it there. Happy to answer any questions and go into greater detail later.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Lauren next.
So I've actually been thinking about two separate things. So first, I've been really taking a look at policing and kind of the origins of policing in this country. Jesse touched on critical race theory and kind of applying this lens to several of what we would call, I guess, our social ills, difficulties that we have in society, to kind of look at how systems were built and whether we can effectively change those systems or whether those systems need to be completely kind of overhauled and start with a new system. And those of you have heard some of the calls to, in quotes, defund the police, right? That's been a very popular call from a lot of groups recently, following all of the police brutality instances that we have seen. George Floyd, I mean, most notably, it's been a year, since his death. And so I think looking at kind of the roots of policing and looking at slave patrols, remembering where modern policing has its roots, and questioning whether we can effectively change something that kind of had very insidious roots for groups of people completely enough that it won't continue to damage those communities, if that makes sense. We have to remember the slave patrols, we have to remember enforcement of Jim Crow laws, all used to, intimidate people and to harm people. And to think that there are enough, if we just get enough diversity in the police force, will that change the machinations of policing enough that history will not continue to impact people of color? And so that's kind of a question that I've been grappling with. As lawyers, we're part of a very archaic system. And so we have seen changes to that system as we've infused it with people with different backgrounds and different experiences. But I think the question that we have in our own legal community, and that is being asked of the police community, is that enough? Or do we need to completely kind of dismantle and rebuild something different? One of the things that people kind of always ask is, okay, if we take that away, then what do we replace it with, right? And so there's this kind of idea that's kind of springing up of community policing. And what does that really mean? And that's basically using partnerships with other types of organizations, so social work, the courts, the punitive systems, with policing, in order to kind of address those social ills, the welfare system, to address those social ills so that we don't have the same type of public safety crises that we are having or experiencing. So it's just that's a very interesting question to me. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts about, can you change a system that was built on racism enough so that we don't have those results in the future? And that's kind of the question that is lingering in my mind as it relates to policing. And then the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is our profession, and how do we make our profession more accessible to people, not only our clients, but also to those who might want to be a part of it. And Jesse, as he talked about issues of education, the digital divide, and how that might impact the entrance of certain groups of people into our profession in the future. And just making sure that we as attorneys are creating space for the next generation of attorneys coming behind us. One of the things that a friend of mine said to me was that we have this emphasis on mentorship, which is important, right? Like having someone help you and give you the yes, no, do this, don't do that. But also there should be an emphasis on sponsorship as well. And sponsorship being someone who is willing to kind of vouch for you, who has been in those rooms, who is willing to put your name in those rooms. And I think that's a place that's often missing for attorneys of color, because we don't have that older uncle or that older person that we know who's a family friend who's an attorney that will walk into that room and say, I know Lauren, she'll be great for this position. And so making sure that we're kind of aware of the different ways informally that people have access, and realizing that a lot of people of color don't have those informal ways of access. And how do we expand that so that that can be something that they get? Or how do we then say, maybe that's not an appropriate avenue of access? So those are kind of the things that I've been thinking about recently as it relates to kind of race issues in our profession and outside of our profession.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I want to circle back on some of those issues, but let's go to Jaquon first.
Hey everyone. So a little bit about me. So a lot of my work and experience have been mostly in community activism, especially when I first went off to college, doing a lot of work with the NAACP in South Carolina, both at the University of South Carolina and on the state level. So a lot of time when I was there is when the social media movements really started to take anchor and take place. The NAACP at one point said the hashtag was I matter, and making it personal. So making your circumstances and your situation personal, to what values do you really have that can affect the world. But the thing that is two things that I really want to talk about. So one being the Black Lives Matter movement and the hashtag. So there's a hashtag name, it seems to be left and right every other week, if not more. And just realizing that with the hashtag, yes, say their name, let people be known, but at some point within different community aspects, we have to deal with our own self-care. So that's definitely an interest in mine, of being hashtag overload, and just feeling tired. Or I've had some friends that even asked me, it was like, hey, did you see the video of this shooting? Or did you see a video of that shooting? Sometimes you just, I'm sorry, I'm tired. I am tired of watching another person being shot and killed on the news. I just am tired of it. So that aspect of, yes, we have to be activists, we have to be known, we have to be in the streets, because we need change in both the streets and change in the suites. It takes both, that has to go hand in hand. But also realizing that in a field of activism, you do have to take some time for yourself to breathe and recoup, for your own personal mental health. And I would say a big thing is when I say the streets and the suites, so the activists that are marching in the streets, the social media activists, and also the ones that are making policies and making decisions, there has to be at some point a seat at a diverse table, where people can share ideas, even though that they might have different approaches to how to get to a resolution. The end goal is the same. How to get there is definitely an interest of mine. Also, I'm a 2019 law school graduate, so I decided to clerk after my first year, and I clerked for Judge Frank Addy, and he was the general sessions judge. So pretty much he was over criminal matters. And just following him throughout the state of South Carolina, I realized that yes, there's a statistic that minorities and people of lower income tend to be in the criminal justice system a whole lot more than others. But a lot of times there's some type of mental health component. So that's something that definitely interests me, of where's the cross section between a person's racial background and upbringing, and how that relates to their mental health, of whether they're self-treating their conditions with different illegal drugs or illegal substances, or whether there's some type of behavioral aspect that was generational, that's a repeating pattern. And it all goes based to some of what Jesse said as far as education, and it goes down to resources. And so that's the two areas of focus that I'm definitely interested in. But as far as moving forward and moving beyond the hashtag, I would say the biggest thing that I would say is look at the Harvard implicit bias studies, to realize that, yes, we all do have a bias some way, shape, form, or fashion, but how do we respect our bias? Acknowledge our bias and respect our bias, and not let our bias naturally influence our decision-making, and be able to have conversations with different individuals from different backgrounds, even though the conversations can definitely be uncomfortable. Because sometimes even in settings to this nature, it's more of we're preaching to the choir, because everyone is quote unquote somewhat woke. to definitely understand and be able to reach out to different people. And also, if you see something wrong, call it out, speak up, say something. But definitely be respectful about it. And maybe it's like, hey, that's probably not the right way to address things, and be able to be open. And you definitely have to be very vulnerable, and it puts you in a very vulnerable state to be able to have those different tough conversations. So that's a tidbit of what I have to say, and be happy to answer questions when the time comes.
Great, thank you all. Now I'd like to have some open discussion. First, with something Lauren said, I'm glad you mentioned sponsorship. I took a DEI course and they talked a lot about this. Those who are in positions of privilege, partners at firms and higher up, really need to reach out and find associates and help boost them up, especially diverse associates, and give them those opportunities, get them into the room. And another thing they talked about is things like golf outings and happy hours at the bar. Those aren't the places where decisions should be made, where people should get opportunities, because they're not inclusive of everyone. Not everyone can play golf. Not everyone drinks. It's fine to have those outings, but it should be purely social and not a, hey, do you want to take on this responsibility? Because it doesn't include everyone. And we did actually get an audience question on this. How would you recommend serving as a sponsor to those entering the legal profession behind you? So for Lauren or whoever else wants to jump in.
I would say if you are in a position to assist in using your influence or your networks to help people get better assignments, increases, promotions, things like that, that's kind of where the sponsor comes in. Whereas the mentor, I feel like, is more helping you expand your network, introduce you to people. The sponsor is more of the person that has, for lack of a better word, like a protege, like somebody that they are invested in their upward mobility and success, and also has the authority or positioning to do so. So like for me, at my job, I don't really have a lot of clout, so to speak. I can mentor people, but I'm not the person that can help with that strategic advancement of their career yet. Hopefully I'll be in that position one day. But if that is you, finding those people that you say, this person has a lot of promise, I've talked with this person, and I'm in a position where I can put them forward and push them forward. I actually have some control over those types of decisions, or I have relationships with people that have that control, if that makes sense. I think what you said, Corey, was really important, that those decisions shouldn't be made on a golf course. They shouldn't be made at a bar. And I would like to think that they are not, but I know that they are. And when you have those things happening, when you are a person of color or a woman or whatever, you might not have the access to the people that are at the golf course or at the bar. And so that becomes important to have. And I see Nicole said, if you were looking for a sponsor, how would you approach someone who has that influence and ask them to sponsor you? I would probably try to let them know what my goals are. I would have a conversation with them. I wouldn't necessarily be like, would you sponsor me? But I would say, these are my goals. This is what I'm trying to do. Do you have any words of advice? Do you know anyone? And that might kind of hopefully ping in their head, okay, yeah, I do know someone, or I can do that for them. I think it can get a little dicey depending on your relationship with the person. But if it's a positive relationship and they're really close to you and they feel invested in the vision for your career and want to see you succeed, then I think that would kind of happen, I would hope, in an organic way. And I also think that it's important to seek out people that can do that for you. So it's kind of a both thing.
Great, thanks for that answer. I want to turn to something Jesse said. You had mentioned critical race theory and how legislatures are trying to remove this from schools. We talked about the importance of history. We know things like slavery happened, the KKK was a thing, lynchings happened. It's important to keep these things in mind and teach them so they don't happen again. It used to be kind of a consensus that these things were wrong, and now we've got a lot more voices speaking up who are frankly, white supremacists. So why is there this pushback against teaching history, teaching Black history in particular, and why is it so important, Jesse?
Well, so thank you for that question, Corey. I believe the answer has a lot of layers to it, but to kind of just hit at the root at it, as a country, the United States doesn't always do the best job of sort of looking at what actually happened in history. We have a way of sort of whitewashing history into the sort of idea of what we thought happened and how we want it to look. But the reality is there were a lot of atrocities that happened over the course of the founding of this country and throughout the development of the country. And for whatever reason, we have a difficult time with just acknowledging it, and sort of we want people to just move on without having ever acknowledged that it happened. And that is the reason why we have so many gaps within, whether it be academics or economics or social gaps. We have all of these gaps because of the way our country developed. And the pushback is coming from this feeling of, well, that was a long time ago. I didn't have anything personally to do with that. I don't engage in those types of activities. But in sort of turning this sort of blind eye, or using this sort of colorblind lens, you're essentially disregarding the experiences of people of color, and you're not acknowledging that some of the issues that we are dealing with are the direct result of the racism and discrimination that occurred in our country. And so that pushback is not surprising, is to be expected, because anytime our country has made an effort to sort of move forward and move away from those bad things, there's always been a pushback movement to sort of counteract the progress that we've made. So you think back to the Civil War, and afterwards we got the Civil War amendments, slavery ended, and then we got the citizenship, we got the right to vote, and Reconstruction started happening, and the former slaves started to make progress. Well, then what happened? All of that got stopped, it got halted. And a few decades later, we ended up with separate but equal, which, kept our country, basically, it held our country back for, half a century. And then you get to Brown v. Board of Education, and separate but equal, the doctrine is removed legally, but it still stays in practice even to this day. It still stays in practice. But if you think back to that era, the country tried to implement things to sort of even the playing field, such as affirmative action or busing and all of these other approaches to try to integrate the schools. But then what happened? Again, there was this pushback to that. And so a lot of that got eroded. And, now we're seeing schools that are just as segregated, if not more, than, pre-Brown v. Board of Education. And so for whatever reason, critical race theory has become the hot buzzword that everyone is using right now, and as I stated earlier, it's only a way to sort of look at the way systems were developed in our country. It's not some secret thing that teachers are telling students when they're in the classroom. It's just a way of sort of looking at how we analyze social issues within our country, within our society. And so the pushback that you're seeing is just basically another attempt to sort of keep us from really acknowledging the things that have happened in our country, and that people of color have, had to deal with these issues, and sort of where they started from. And until we're able to really kind of grapple with that, we're going to always have this back and forth, or this tension that happens between the two opposing sides.
Thanks, Jesse. I want to cover something else Lauren said, and then we'll get to Jaquon. You had talked about reforming policing, and it's been a lot of attempts to do so from the local to the national level. And policing, by and large, remains the same as of now. There's been talk that maybe someone else should respond to things like mental illness. How do we get there? How do we change policing, and what are some roadblocks that are preventing that from happening? Lauren?
I think that people, and this is going to sound very out there, but I'll say it. I think that people have to broaden their imaginations. I think because we live in a system in which the police handle everything from I'm scared, I think somebody's knocking on the door, to there's somebody that's having a mental health crisis in the middle of the street. People can't conceptualize something different. So when they hear something like defund the police, their ears shut down. They just can't even imagine, well, what does that mean? Will we not be safe? So I think that's the first thing, is kind of getting over the hump of this is the way it's always been, and this is the only way that it can be. The second thing is we have to put our resources or our money where our mouth is. We can't spend all of this money on the police department and then underfund all of the other social things that we need, all the community projects that we need. We can't then shut down the Boys and Girls Club and then wonder why kids are hanging out at night in the middle. You know what I mean? Like those are the things that, to me, serve as roadblocks. It's like where are our resources and our money going? So I think if we can open our minds and our imaginations to what is possible in our communities and what causes these social ills. And I think what Jesse said was on point. What causes people to commit crime? What causes drug use? What causes these things? Like, what are the root issues, and what is a better way to address them other than locking people up, or separating families and harming people? How can we be a society that is more focused on community care, taking care of people in the community, and making sure people have their needs met, their basic needs met? So I think one of the main roadblocks is people can't envision a different world. And I think that we have to work hard on that, because as adults, I think our imaginations can be a little bit limited because we've seen so much. But opening our minds and also looking at how we spend our money and our resources in our communities, finding out how much money are we spending on policing? How much money are we spending on our schools? How much money are we spending on healthcare? How much money are we spending? And how are we spending and allocating our resources? Because to me, that's a big part of it too. It's like, well, we're spending all this money here and we're doing all this here. It's like, yeah, but what are we doing on the other side? So I think those two things are big roadblocks, in that we are heavily invested financially, mentally, and emotionally in what we think policing does, even though we know that it doesn't do that.
And Corey, can I add in?
Of course, go ahead.
A little bit to what Lauren said. So some of you may know that policing and criminal justice issues is sort of the other other thing that I've researched and sort of studied in the past. And so to just kind of echo what Lauren was saying, when we're talking about policing, you know, again, you hear these buzzwords, defund the police. That's something for people to kind of attach an emotion to, and then use that as a sort of way to kind of not talk about the actual issues because we're so focused on this catchphrase. And essentially, when people are saying defund the police, you can interpret that as saying we need to look at reallocating our resources to the things that society actually needs. And this is, so basically I'm just restating what Lauren just said in a different way. That's what the emphasis is on, is what are we placing the value on, you know, and how do we change our focus so that some of these other things, like Jaquon was talking about, the mental health issues that we're seeing within our communities, how do we address that? Instead of sending officers, how about we send, you know, officers plus mental health, you know, specialists or someone to work with it? Or how about we introduce the proper training during the police, when the officers are getting trained, we introduce them to these sort of mental health approaches to dealing with individuals, so that the first option doesn't become, you know, shoot, ask questions later. We sort of go through these other strategies to help individuals, because at the end of the day, the police are there to protect and serve. And it's not about this sort of authority, this idea of authority that some officers have, not all, but some. And, you know, we have to remember that we're there to serve the community. And hopefully that's just another way that we can sort of look at this issue that Lauren is pointing out.
And I want to piggyback on some of what Lauren mentioned as well. And if you think of it in a historical context, the state hospitals closed and the prisons expanded. That's pretty much what happened. I feel like the prison system and criminal justice system is treating people with different health issues and mental health issues and different types of trauma, whether it being racial trauma or community or historical trauma that has happened within the family, generation after generation after generation. It's there. The hospitals closed, the jails, prisons expanded, and then even with that expansion, you can get into private prisons, and there's a whole nother can of worms of issues that surround private prisons. And also, as far as there's some different spectrums. Some people defund the police. Some people equate that with get rid of the police. I am not of that persuasion. I'm of the more of what Jesse mentioned as to restructure funding. And I believe that a lot goes back to the training aspect and the training and resources in community policing. One part being training is like, okay, well, you get a 22-year-old or 25-year-old, send them to academy for a couple weeks or even a couple months. Their background is what they're bringing to the academy. You can't retrain and reteach or rewire a person in a couple of weeks and then hand them a badge, a gun, a taser, whatever, and have them be the law enforcement and executioners. So I definitely feel like a lot of it should be restructuring of funding, and as far as putting more funding towards the actual training of what does it really mean to be a police officer. Because you hear some older police officers saying, well, I've never even had to pull my weapon. And what does it mean to be to fear? Because people say, well, I was in fear of what? Well, why were you fearful? And was there some type of underlying root cause or some type of experience that you had even before you were a police officer that made you fearful? And Lauren mentioned on this earlier, as far as policing goes and community policing, actually seeing police within the community, because in my view, police are policing in very densely populated areas. Those are some of the more suburban areas, some of the more urban areas where there are lower incomes, multi-generational housing, and people that are more compact, and some that are leaning on the different social programs that in a way can micromanage people and their movements and what they're allowed to do and what they can and cannot do, and even down to what they can and cannot eat. So that's one aspect, that there's crime and issues happening everywhere. It's just, where are police choosing to focus their patrol car? Are they going down the suburban streets with the $500,000 homes where there's still crime and drug usage, or are they going down the more urban street?
I also would just like to throw in there too, Jaquon. There's also, my stepfather is a police officer, and he was a police officer for 30 years, never pulled his weapon, but he policed a community that he was familiar with. And so I've seen, and he's seen, there's a shift where they are training people in certain places and then sending them into communities that they are not familiar with. And they're seeing things that they're unfamiliar with, they're not comfortable with. And so that also heightens levels of discomfort and fear, because they have not been privy to the types of activities that might be considered normal in one community and, you know, abhorrent in another community. So I think that that's also a thing that we need to look at as well. Is like, where are we putting people, and are we training the people appropriately to be placed in certain communities as well?
I completely agree with you. Flashback moment to my personal life, because I remember as a kid growing up, police officers, there was a family reunion happening. Police officers stopped by, some of them in their uniforms, playing basketball, football with us at the community center where we decided to host a family reunion. And that's it builds a trust level between the different citizens and the police. And even, I would say, policing, and even for those that are in criminal practice and prosecution, actually knowing the community where you're prosecuting can definitely make a difference.
I do a whole seminar on policing, but I wanted to go back to something Jaquon said. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. And of course, BLM was started in 2013 after Trayvon Martin was killed and his killer was acquitted. There's been a lot of misinformation about the network. White folks sometimes read that as Black Lives Only Matter, and they've responded with things like All Lives Matter, or they view it as anti-police and respond with Blue Lives Matter. It's been called a number of things, including a terrorist organization. So just to kind of set things straight, Jaquon, tell us a little bit about BLM. What is it? How can allies support their mission?
So Black Lives Matter, as mentioned, started after the death of Trayvon Martin, unfortunately. And it's pretty much Black Lives Matter 2 is the perspective that I would put on it. It's like, yes, we know all lives matter, blue lives matter. And I've even heard one that red lives matter, saying that we're all from the blood of Jesus Christ, and we're the red lives. So the Christians' lives matter. But I think it's more of a Black Lives Matter 2 type deal, because it's, well, I hate to say it, but Black lives and people of color are the lives that are being the hashtags. So it's like, okay, yes, we do understand that all lives matter, but today we're concerned about the Black lives, because those are some of the ones that are being more marginalized, discriminated against, and dealing with different types of historical trauma that Jesse mentioned earlier, as far as going back from civil rights movement and growing up hearing stories of your grandparents saying, well, I remember, and even parents, like even my parents telling stories like, yeah, I remember the white only sign and when the National Guard had come through and things of that nature. So it's just more of a focus in bringing light and attention to particular issues that people of color are having, is where I really believe that the hashtag Black Lives Matters actually stems from.
All right, thanks. So we haven't really even touched on things like housing or economics. We've discussed in prior panels how there are great wealth disparities based on race. There are disparities in housing due to redlining, education, and access to healthcare. We've seen that during the pandemic, especially. Just kind of broadly, how do we improve things? Are we making progress? Is it going to be a long process? And where are we going? I'll leave that open to whoever wants to answer. And if nobody jumps in, I'm going to call on
I'll
Laura.
go.
Looks ready.
We have a long way to go. And I think the reason that we have a long way to go kind of stems back to what you kind of touched on. I think what Jesse touched on is people don't want to talk about the race part. And so until people are ready to have honest and open conversations about the history of housing in this country, about economic disparity, about access to healthcare. And, for me, I'll just give you a personal tidbit. I'm an African-American woman of a certain age, and even controlling for my education and my income, I have my risk of maternal death is 3 to 4 times greater than that of a white woman of lower education and lower income. So when we talk about these things, that is one that I always bring up, because I think people think, once there's like a leveling off point where race doesn't really have anything to do with specific issues, and it does. So until people are ready to really have serious conversations about the impact of race on all of these different facets of society, we'll never get to a place of betterment of those things. I mean, you have to call a thing, as Jan Van Zandt would say. You have to call it what it is in order to actually face and address that issue. And so while we have made inroads, and there are individuals who have done better, and I hate when people say, well, I know this person who grew up in the hood and they went to college, and we use this like exceptionalism narrative to say things are better. If we look at statistics, as Jesse said, some schools are even more segregated than they were when, our parents and grandparents were going to school. How is that possible in 2021? We look at economic disparities and we still see them. The digital divide is still huge. So until we as a country are really willing to really have honest conversations and to not feel like people are being accusatory, because I think that's also why people push back. I think a lot of times when you bring up race, white people say, it wasn't me, like I didn't do anything. And it's not an accusation of you as an individual. It's just the reality of how this system has worked and how it developed. And I think that until we are able to acknowledge those things and to say personal responsibility, because right now the narrative is personal responsibility only, right? Like you are responsible for you in a vacuum. That's not the reality of the world that we live in. Yes, I'm responsible for me, but there are other things that have happened that impact who I am and the life that I'm living. And if we don't address those things, then it's not really fair to say that you are responsible for 100% of everything that's ever happened, because that's not true. So until we have those really honest conversations, we're going to continue to fight each other and regress. And that's just the way that I kind of see what is happening with the 2 steps forward, 4 steps back thing that we kind of have going on right now.
Thank you for that, Lauren. Anyone else want to jump in on that or move to the next question? Nobody's jumping. So I've got one more question, and then I'll leave a little time for open statements. Lauren mentioned that these issues won't simply be resolved at the interpersonal level. So what can attorneys and people of privilege do to use their influence? Should we be protesting, pressuring officials, running for office, donating, all of the above? And I'll let you each take that one, or whoever wants to answer. Maybe we'll start with Jesse.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I've said in the past when I've done talks is we all have a role to play. So to tell you individually what you should be out there doing, that's a question that you have to answer for yourself. Some people are naturally better at, or they don't mind being on the front line. So they're the ones who are out there protesting and marching and sort of shouting and bringing attention that way. Others may be more in the background, maybe more of an introvert. And so you can do the calling of elected officials or the letter writing campaigns, or you can do something like hosting a discussion at your home and just inviting a few friends or family members. Or it could be something as simple as if you're at a function and someone says something that is incorrect or that is offensive, you stepping up and just challenging them or correcting them in that moment. Instead of just, complaining about it later, correcting them in that moment, it helps to sort of eliminate things on this sort of micro level. So again, it's really open-ended as far as what you can do as an individual. Is whatever you feel comfortable doing, whatever you feel like you have the knowledge and this skill set to do, then just go out there and do it. And you can do that individually. You can do it along with others in a group. But whatever it is, just do something, because sitting back and doing nothing is just essentially allowing the problem to continue on. So you may say, well, as an individual, I don't do those things. I'm not racist. I'm not discriminating against anyone. But at some point, knowing that there's a problem and still just sitting back and doing nothing, you are essentially becoming part of the problem.
And I'll also say what piggyback off of what Jesse said, do what you're good at, no matter what it is. I said earlier when I spoke, it was like there's change in the suites and change in the streets. They depend on each other. Everything works together to get a purpose and a goal accomplished. But you do have to be willing to be a little bit uncomfortable and be vulnerable. If you're a money grinder, hey, if you got the money to donate to some campaign that can help them with the resources to get their message across, hey, that's your contribution. If you have the time to go talk to a legislator, go talk to the legislator. If you're good at drafting different types of policies and powerful in words, work to see if you can assist with some type of policy. It's different ways that a person get involved, but definitely everybody has their own talent and craft. You can use that to the advantage to uplift the community.
And I would say, and I'm a big proponent of educating yourself, because I do think education, leads to more curiosity, which often leads people to do things. So the more that you can learn about history, the more that you can learn about culture, the more that you can learn about people, hopefully will engender some feelings of connectedness. And it won't just be, I'm just doing this because this is what's PC or cool right now. I'm doing this because I recognize that this is something that needs to be actually addressed, because I have some insight and some education about it. So I would also say, on top of what Jesse and Jaquon said, educate yourself, and that doesn't mean find your nearest Black person and ask them a bunch of questions. It means, Google reading lists, if you're not a big reader, find something on Audible, find a documentary, learn something, kind of educate yourself, so that in doing these things and doing this work, you're also aware of why it's important, other than the fact that this is a hot button issue right now, because this is people's real lives and have been their real lives for generations. So I really do think that education is a component that's really important too.
Great, thank you all for some concrete ideas. Try to keep it to about an hour, so we'll do open statements, take a couple of minutes, just say whatever you want to leave us with, book recommendations or whatever. Let's start with Jaquon.
So you can use as far as recommendations go, I would say definitely use your Netflix and Amazon streaming. There's different types of Black Lives Matter and educating yourself. 13th is a great documentary. Also, I just watched Underground, even though it's fictitious. By seeing that, the depictions, it definitely makes a person uncomfortable. So that you really have, as what Lauren mentioned, the educational background that, okay, this is the trauma behind things. But I'll say definitely just be comfortable being uncomfortable in some situations, and just be willing to ask the questions. And as Lauren mentioned, just do your own research. Watch movies. There's a lot of different information that you can learn from movies and different types of documentaries that's available on different streaming platforms.
On that note, I just watched the United States versus Billie Holiday on Bulluck. That was a very eye-opening film. During that time, Hoover was running the FBI, and she had a famous song called Strange Fruit, which, if you don't know, is about lynching, not very transparently. And the powers that be didn't like her singing that because it gave people, quote, the wrong ideas. So, and they couldn't really police that because we have a constitution. So they would go after her for her drug problem. And I won't spoil it too much, but I encourage you to watch the film. Lauren, let's go to you next.
I just want to thank you, Corey, for having this first and foremost. But I would just say, we have to stay on top of this. We can't let this just be a cultural moment. It often happens that there's a hashtag that's, everybody's hashtagging for a couple months and it kind of dies down. So just remember that, Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, Breonna, these were real people. These are people, they're not just hashtags. This is not just a cultural moment. This is the reality of people's lives. And it's really important that allies are there, because we've been saying these things for forever. So it's really important that our allies stand up with us. And I love the streets and suites thing that Jaquon said, because it's so true. Wherever you are, whatever your sphere of influence is, you can make a difference. So please, be mindful of that and move forward knowing that this is the work. Period. Like this is the work of who we are as attorneys, and this is the work of our lives. So just don't forget that.
Thanks, Lauren. Jesse, last word.
So again, I'm just going to echo what both Jaquon and Lauren have stated. If I had anything to add to it, just be open-minded. It may be a little uncomfortable at first, but as you educate yourself, as you continue to expand your social circles and just expose yourself to different cultures and different backgrounds, you'll adjust and you'll be okay. And I also would even believe that your life will even be enriched by the meeting of having such a diverse group of people within your social circles. And just be genuine when you do it. Don't do it for superficial reasons. Just be a genuine person, because really you're connecting with another person. It's not someone, it's not an alien, it's not something that, you know, you can't understand. And you'll find that you'll find similarities, you'll find things that connect you to other people. So just be open to doing it. And again, if you see something that somebody else does, don't be afraid to call it out. You know, at some point, again, we all have to make an individual choice on whether we're going to stand on the side of right. And you are never wrong for standing on the side of something that's right.
Thanks, Jesse. And just on that note, I didn't know how to go about doing these events. I wanted to do something, but wasn't sure the best way to do it. So I reached out to some people, ended up talking to Jesse, and we talked about the best way to do this. And I think it's worked out very well. And pretty much all of it is because of our great panelists. So thank you all, and thank you to our past panelists. Thank you to the attendees for showing up and asking questions. These recordings are all available on the Minnesota Statewide website. Thanks to the Knoxville Alumni Chapter for hosting the Zoom link. We'll continue this conversation in one form or another. Remember, the IAB meeting is tonight at 6:30 Central. All are welcome to attend. Good night and take care.